Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our March Sustainability webinar. And in this webinar, we're looking at AASB S2 Explained, and that is we're starting with the journey through AASB S2, and we're starting with climate science meets policy. Today, the presenters, I've got with me Ramona Amos, who's a senior manager in our IFRS and corporate reporting team. So hello, Ramona.
Hi, everybody.
So the two of us will be the duo as the presenters today. And then BDO would like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea and community. And we pay our respect to their elders, past and present, and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. Now, this is the third sustainability webinar for 2026. We started with sustainability reporting, what's changing and what's expected in 2026. Last month, we looked at making the case why sustainability should matter to CEOs and boards. And then this month, we start unpacking and exploring the details of AASB S2. And we thought a logical starting place would be to start with the underpinning climate science and where that meets climate policy. And then we'll go on to look at governance and climate risk assessment, scenario analysis, etc. I also want to call out our May session. As you know, many of our clients and other entities are currently reporting their first mandatory sustainability report for 31 December 2025. And therefore, in May, we will have a webinar where we look at lessons from year one. What lessons can we learn and some of our observations. So I think that is an important one to mark in your calendar. I would also like to invite you to our next Carbon Accounting Masterclass, which is a virtual full day. The next session is on Wednesday, the 13th of May, and you can register now. We've already had more than 750 businesses attend this Carbon Accounting Masterclass over the last 2 years, so please join the crowd. And then after you've attended this Carbon Accounting Masterclass, you will also be part of our alumni community, which meets every quarter. To start off today's session, as we always do, we would like to start with the latest developments. Now, first of all, on Monday this week, the World Meteorological, I can't pronounce that word, Ramona, organization, published the state of, yes, thank you very much. I cannot say it. It's too hard for this Afrikaans mind of mine. You'll have to teach me that I say it slowly. The State of the Global Climate Report 2025 was published, and a few interesting things in there. And we'll unpack this a little bit later in the session. But this is the very latest information from the scientists around the state of the global climate. Then also want to flag with you that ASIC has released sustainability reporting training. Now, they started releasing it just before Christmas in December. And to date, they've released 8 modules of training. And I've got a link there to the website, so you can go there. And under each module, there are a number of PDF documents giving a bit of an overview of the requirements and some guidance. So ASIC, our regulator, really good that they're doing this. They've worked with the Australian Accounting Standards Board and the university to develop this, so good modules for you to have a look at. And then also, last month in our webinar, we talked about the questions that boards should be asking management and executive leadership teams. And after that webinar, we've actually authored 2 articles. The one is on how climate reporting is reshaping CEO and board accountability. And the other one is climate disclosure is now a governance test. Boards should start with these questions. And I've got links to those two articles in there. It was part of our March Corporate Reporting Insights, and it will also be distributed tomorrow as part of our March Sustainability News. I think there's some good food for thought, especially for board members in there. So to kick off our journey on AASB S2, it's really important that we go back to the objective and the scope of AASB S2. Now, the objective of AASB S2 climate-related disclosures is to require an entity to disclose information about its climate-related risks and opportunities that is useful to primary users of the general purpose financial reports in making decisions relating to providing resources to the entity. So maybe just unpacking a few things quickly. AASB S2 is a disclosure standard. So AASB S2 is not mandating the organization to set targets, for example. It's not mandating the organization to implement particular risk management processes or to implement particular strategies. It is requiring an entity to disclose information of what they've done. Now, the specific disclosure requirements, there's 150 of them, I might add, the disclosure requirements are all centered around climate-related risks and opportunities. And therefore, it's important to understand what are climate-related risks and opportunities and what are the drivers of climate-related risk and opportunities. And it's information that's useful to primary users, and primary users would be current and future investors in the business and current and future financiers of the business. So it's not just your current shareholders or current providers of financing, the bank. It's also looking at a future perspective. And so don't look at primary users too narrowly. And then to help them to make decisions, do they want to continue to provide their financing, their resources to the entity? So that's the objective of AASB S2. And then AASB S2 requires an entity to disclose information about climate-related risk and opportunities. And now a very important phrase, that could reasonably be expected to affect the entity's cash flows, its access to finance or cost of capital over the short, medium, or long term. Now, again, you have to focus on a few things here. It's climate-related risk and opportunities. The second thing, could reasonably be expected. So could reasonably be expected is saying we're looking at a market perspective. What would the market expect, what would the market expect that would impact us? And therefore, that's what we have to disclose. So it's a market perspective, could reasonably be expected to affect. So that's the second thing. The third thing is throughout the standard, they talk about could reasonably be expected to affect the entity's prospects. And when you hear the word prospects, you should think cash flows, access to finance, cost of capital. So they use prospects as a shorthand. And then it's also over the short, medium, or long term. So it's not a narrow view over the next year, short, medium, or long term. And then also, AASB S2 requires an entity to disclose information about climate-related risk and opportunities that could reasonably be expected to affect the entity's prospects. So they replace the long list of 3 bullet items with prospects over the short, medium, or long term. They also say that AASB S2 applies to climate-related risks that's the entity is exposed to, and those could be physical risk, or it could be transition risks, or it could be both. And it also applies to climate-related opportunities. So really important when you look at that, have we covered risks and opportunities? And looking at risk, have we considered potential physical risks and potential transition risks? And they also make the statement very clearly. If there are climate-related risks and opportunities that could not reasonably be expected to affect the entity's prospects, that would then be outside the scope of AASB S2, and those risks and opportunities don't need to be disclosed. So if a risk and opportunity could reasonably be expected to impact the entity's prospects, you have to disclose that risk, that opportunity, and apply the rest of AASB S2 to those risks and opportunities. So there's a very clear focus on climate-related risk and opportunities. And in addition to that, those climate risk and opportunities that could reasonably be expected to impact the entity's prospects. Now, a really good way to pull it all together is to look at a diagram that was previously included in the TCFD report in 2017. But remember, AASB S2 has been built on top of the TCFD report. And in this figure, they've tried to link all the risks, the transition risk, the physical risks, and all the opportunities, and said all these risks and opportunities impact strategic planning, impact risk management, and ultimately flow through to the financial impact on the income statement, cash flow statement, and the balance sheet. And if you look at this diagram, it's a little bit like a roadmap to the disclosure requirements in AASB S2, because you have to disclose risks and opportunities. You have to disclose the strategic implication of those. You have to disclose risk management of those risks and opportunities. And you also have to disclose the financial impact in the current year, also anticipated financial impact in future years, as well as consider potential financial impact under the various scenarios. So it all links together. Now, having done an introduction of the scope and the objective of AASB S2, it's quite clear that the starting point for AASB S2 is the identification of climate-related risks and opportunities. So if we want to identify climate-related risks and opportunities, it's really important to understand what is underpinning climate-related risk and opportunities, and that is climate change. So we have to understand what is climate change and how does climate change lead to risks and opportunities for your business. So really important that we understand climate change. Now, we've come up with a diagram to maybe represent it visually. And we see it as there's climate science that could lead to climate-related risk and opportunities. And the climate science is usually linked to physical risks and opportunities. And then there's also climate policy. And climate policy are often the bit that are linked to transitional risks and opportunities. So if you look at the science, but you also look at the policy that's been implemented by governments across the world, together that will give you a good view of climate-related risk and opportunities, physical risks and transition risks. So what we'll do today, we first look at climate science and explore climate change and how that could lead to climate-related risk and opportunities. And then separately, we'll look at climate policy and give you some examples of climate policies in Australia and abroad and how that could lead to transitional risks. So let's start with climate science. Now, from a climate science perspective, we've gone to the United Nations, looked at their website, and as you know, our presentations always have a lot of active links in it. So this is a link to United Nations website on climate change. and extracts from what they define or what they say about climate change. So climate change refers to long-term shifts in temperature and weather patterns. So such shifts can be natural due to changes in the sun's activity or large volcanic eruptions. But we also know that since the 1800s, human activities have been the main driver of climate change, primarily due to the burning of fossil fuels like coal, oil, and gas. So it's the human activities that's kind of supercharged climate change. Burning fossil fuels generates greenhouse gas emissions that act like a blanket wrapped around the Earth, trapping the sun's heat and raising temperatures. So you can see we've talked about fossil fuels, we've talked about coal, oil, gas, greenhouse gas emissions. You can already see why AASB S2 requires us to measure our greenhouse gas emissions and consider whether we want to set targets and how does that impact physical risk and transition risks. Also talk about the main greenhouse gases that are causing climate change include carbon dioxide and methane. And you'll see later on that's why there's policies around carbon dioxide and methane. So these greenhouse gases come from using gasoline for driving a car or coal for heating a building. Clearing land and cutting down forests can also release carbon dioxide. And we know the World Resources Institute have in January released a new greenhouse gas protocol on how we measure the consequences of clearing land and cutting down forests. There's also agriculture. Oil and gas operations are major sources of methane emissions. That's a bad thing. And then we know that energy, industry, transport, buildings, agriculture, and land use are among the main sectors causing greenhouse gases. And climate scientists have showed, and this is important, these are scientists that's come up with this. It's not Ramona and I as accountants coming up with this, but the scientists at the United Nations have come up with that they've showed that humans are responsible for virtually all global heating over the last 200 years. And human activities, like the ones that we've mentioned above, are causing greenhouse gases that are warming the world faster than at any time in at least the last 2,000 years. So that's a foundation, a starting point around climate change on what the scientists say. So now we want to deal with a few myth busters around climate change. And again, we've picked it up from the United Nations.
So as Aletta mentioned, the UN has released what I think is quite a good, useful website for some of the particular pieces of information that are often presented as reasons for why climate change isn't happening. So one particular aspect of this website is focusing on that climate change is happening and is already affecting every region around the Earth, changing rainfall patterns and sea levels, warming the ocean and intensifying extreme weather events, as most people have experienced in some respect. That's also affecting health and ability to grow food, and some regions are more vulnerable than others, particularly small island developing nations. And so just talking about the fact that it's quite widespread and rapid and intensifying, and but as was mentioned earlier, that this is a long-term change, so happening things like sea level rise and melting ice sheets happening over a long period of time and expected to be irreversible.
Then the next one to look at, a myth buster. Yes, a fact that climate change is caused by human activity. I think a lot of people have been saying, you know, yes, climate change, there are natural cycles, but the research have shown that the climate change and the fast tracking of climate change is actually caused by human activity. And we know that we've, over the last 200 years, there's been a lot of developments, industrialization across the world, and all of that would have led to more manufacturing, more use of fossil fuels, and therefore not good for the environment.
So another aspect of the Mythbuster section on the website is just calling out that ultimately scientists agree that humans are responsible for climate change, and a lot of studies have been done to demonstrate the percentage of scientists that do agree for that, that humans are responsible. So a 97% consensus. A 2021 study found a greater than 99% consensus looking at peer-reviewed scientific literature. The report released by the IPCC that we will talk about later, the synthesis report that is released to inform policymakers, has categorically confirmed that human activity is the overwhelming cause.
Then, another fact, every fraction of a degree of warming matters. So with every increment of global warming, extreme heat and rainfall events become more frequent and more intense. So it's really important. Greenhouse gases such as carbon dioxide from human activities are responsible for approximately 1.5 degrees of warming since the 1850s. And this has already caused significant changes in the climate, including more extreme weather events, which have caused widespread harm to people and the nature. And in Australia, we experienced this firsthand. If we look at currently the floods in WA, I was just in WA 2 weeks ago with the most glorious weather, and now they've got a cyclone. We had cyclone in Brisbane last year. We have floods, we have fires. So in Australia, we understand this. Obviously, in different part of the world, this presents differently. Interesting that for us in Australia, it's very visible.
So the next fact on the Mythbusters site talks about climate models, and that they are the fact that they're reliable scientific tools. So the previous slide was referring to the potential different futures. So 1.5 degrees of warming, or 2 degrees or 3 degrees, and there's a expected difference between those different outcomes. And so the modeling of those different outcomes and the scenarios that the scientific tools run and provide information of what those different impacts could look like is reliable information for things like looking at the impacts of risks and opportunities for your business, to look at uncertainty around these different outcomes and what those impacts might be in the regions that you're operating, or for particular types of weather events, whether that be increases in temperature or increased severity of heat waves and those sorts of things.
The next fact is climate change is making storms, floods, and wildfires more frequent and more intense. And often it's the more intense that can be really problematic. Higher temperatures increase atmospheric moisture, which results in heavier rainfall events and stronger winds, raising storm and flood risks. And hotter temperatures also dry out soil and vegetation, creating ideal conditions for wildfires to ignite and spread rapidly. They've also said the number of climate-related hazards has increased 5-fold in the past 50 years. And the economic toll of these disasters is accelerating. And they've given us some idea of the average annual costs that rose from around 70 to 80 billion US dollars to 180 to 200 billion US dollars over the last 20 odd years. So reflecting that growing intensity and impact on climate-related extreme events.
So the next fact is that extreme heat is one of the deadliest climate risks. So studies have shown that globally, deaths associated with cold temperatures outnumber those from heat. However, due to climate change, the deaths caused by heat is growing and is becoming one of the deadliest hazards. So again, looking in the recent past, it caused deaths of around 489,000 every year. And this, among older people, is estimated to have risen 85%. The extreme heat events are becoming more frequent, longer, and more severe. And by the mid-century, it is expected that the heat deaths will rise sharply, outpacing the cold-related deaths.
And again, for us in Australia, Ramona, we've got so many workers working outside on mines, on roads, infrastructure. And as soon as people are working outside and we've got extreme temperatures, it really has an impact on their well-being. And often heat also results in mental health issues. So, you know, again, we see this one in Australia. And then, as Ramona discussed earlier, 97% of experts agree that global warming is happening and we are the cause as humans. So I think we've tried to present to you the science underpinning climate change and why the government and the Australian Accounting Standards Board have decided to say businesses have to consider the impact of this, consider the risk, consider the opportunities, and disclose that. However, I do want to make the point, we often present to boards and we present to management and executives that do not believe in climate change and disagree with the scientists. However, at this stage with mandatory sustainability reporting, it's taken out of the hands of, or it's no longer an issue, do you agree or disagree? This is a thing, we have to mandatorily report it to primary users. It's part of the annual report. But I just thought it might be good to at least provide some information on the science behind it, underpinning all of this. I think the other thing to mention, the United Nations, and in particular the International Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, which is a United Nations body for assessing the science related to climate change. The whole purpose for this body, intergovernmental body, is that they provide policymakers with regular scientific assessments on climate change, its implications, and its potential future risks, as well as to put forward adaptation and mitigation options. So the Intergovernmental Panel do all this work independently. They try to inform governments on what's coming, what the risks and opportunities could be. And government, based on that, will set policy for the different countries. And those policies then become a reality for businesses in those countries. So this is really the starting point for what our government would consider. If you look at the Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, their most recent report, the sixth assessment report, was published in 2023. What looks like a period of time, the synthesis report on climate change in 2023. The previous version, the fifth assessment report, the synthesis report was in 2014, so roughly 9-10 years ago. And again, you can see in there the application at a global level, a regional level, specifically for Australia. So great information, and this underpins what we do. So this again is a link to the Climate Change 2023, the latest report. AASB S2, by the way, specifically refers to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and Assessment Report 6 as the most recent report. So you can see the clear link between the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and the standard that businesses have to apply in Australia. As part of that report, it's a lengthy report. What's interesting, and we're trying today to give you resources and information to help you consider, identify, assess climate-related risks and opportunities. So one of the things to look at is there's a regional facts sheet for Australia or Australasia, where they're talking about, the second item, heat extremes have increased, cold extremes have decreased, and these trends are projected to continue. And they say we've got a high confidence associated with that. They give information on sea level rises, etc. So you can see a lot of useful information for different regions. And where I can see you using this, you have to consider climate-related risks and opportunities across your whole value chain. And this report has a regional fact sheet for all the regions across the world. And if you know your supplier is based in a particular region, this could help you with some initial thinking about what could be the physical risks in that particular region, a region where you've got a supplier or a customer. They even go further. So for Australia, there are diagrams where they distinguish between 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, and 4 degrees, what the impact on Australia would be concerning, annual maximum temperature, minimum temperature, total precipitation, and then also a maximum one-day precipitation and some projections. So again, detailed information that Australian entities could use. For Australia, they go further because Australia is a big country. They break it down in Northern Australia, Central Australia, Southern Australia, and Eastern Australia, and again, more specific information. These are just extracts, it's not everything, but just to give you an idea where you can get information around physical risks.
So another extract from the IPCC 6 assessment report as well, just showing where the already observed impacts are within the economy and impacting communities, so around water availability and food production, as well as health and well-being, cities, settlements and infrastructure, and biodiversity and ecosystems. Not from that report because it's more recent information, just the World Meteorological Organization confirmed that 2024 was the hottest year on record with an increase of 1.55 degrees. I think also that just brings to mind to the point around the goals and targets to limit temperature increases by 1.5 degrees is an average increase over to 2100. So although this hottest year has already exceeded 1.5 degrees, that doesn't mean that target has already been lost, although it's getting increasingly harder to meet. So there's been increasing impacts on water availability and food production, and particularly affecting the agriculture, health and infrastructure sectors. So as I said, the 1.5 degree target is getting harder to meet, and a 2 degree target hard to meet as well. We've seen in the future we can expect an increase in severity and frequency of extreme weather events. So heat waves, as we've already discussed, droughts, floods and bushfires, and the impacts across the world differ depending on the region, which is why there's those regional fact sheets, even just in Australia, quite different impacts depending on the region, and varied impacts with different levels of warming in the future. The longer term changes around sea level rise and rainfall patterns also anticipated. So as Aletta mentioned earlier, just this week, the the WMO released the State of the Global Climate report. This is a much shorter report, a lot easier to digest, and we've included some extracts from that in the presentation today. But so this is confirmed that 2015 to 2025 are the 11 hottest years on record. So 2025 was slightly cooler than 2024, but the last 3 years, the hottest on record as well. So in this report, just providing information about changes that have already been experienced. So a new focus in this report around also this year around energy and where the additional energy within the Earth's atmosphere is stored, and a focus on the impact that that's having on the ocean. So also in the report, references to changes in sea level rise, so that they've remained near record high levels, and that's been observed in 2024. And it's rising, or has risen at an annual rate of 4.75 millimeters, which seems like a small amount, but over time, as has been articulated before, a long-term change, and also particularly impacting the smaller island nations initially. Arctic and Antarctic sea ice extents were both below average, and the maximum daily extent was in 2025 was the lowest annual maximum in the observed record. Glacier mass loss, not something we're particularly familiar with potentially in Australia, but observed in the Antarctic, but also the Arctic. So among 5 most negative glacier mass balances on record, and also large regional variations in precipitation, some regions having abnormally wet years. I think the Gold Coast and Queensland have been experiencing a very wet March this year, but then also abnormally dry weather in other regions around the world in 2025.
I think, Ramona, no, you go ahead.
So just the report's just talking about that there's been diverse extreme events and had widespread impact. As we talked to before, heat waves is a particular impact, particularly on health, but also around rainfalls and floods, and thunderstorms and wind. The changes in temperature and rainfall patterns have increased dengue and so other heat impacts also over the recent decades.
I think the other thing to have a look at, and apologies for interrupting you, Ramona, is the CSIRO report, which specifically looks at Australia, and their latest state of the climate was published in 2024. So again, if you're looking for more Australian specific information, I think also easier to digest, some key points for Australia, usually some very good graphs to give us an idea of how climate change is impacting Australia. The next one that I'll hand over to Ramona is at the end of last year, and I think it was October, November, the Australian government have published our first national climate risk assessment. And there's some very interesting information in here.
Thanks, Aletta. Yes, it was October last year that the Australian released this report. And so this is really applying the climate science and the changes in weather to what impacts that's having and potential to have on Australia as a country. So the key hazards that have been identified and explored around flooding and tropical cyclones, that's one where there's a decrease in the frequency anticipated, but an increase in intensity. Also, changing patterns. A cyclone in Brisbane last year is not normal, and I believe the tracking of the recent cyclone across Queensland, Northern Territory and Western Australia, quite unusual as well. Extreme temperatures are likely to increase nationwide. Coastal hazards from sea level rise, also drought, the time spent in drought is likely to increase across most of the country. Obviously impacts for agriculture, particularly in other water intensive industries there. Bushfire, as we have seen in the past, so the higher temperatures and dry conditions will increase the risk of bushfires and dangerous fire weather days as well. Ocean warming and acidification, so really impacting marine life, and so the Great Barrier Reef and tourism in particular impacted by that. Storms as well, so extratropical storms are projected to become less frequent, similar to the tropical cyclones, but then impacts would have potentially greater intensity when they occur. So the report explores a number of different scenarios, so and thinking about AASB S2 and the scenario analysis requirements. So it looks at what different impacts could be experienced under 1.5, 2 and 3 degrees, and comparing that to the current 1.2 degree levels of rising. And so some really summarized and useful information around potential increases in things like extreme heat wave days, fire susceptibility, maximum runoff, so impacts from increased rainfall, and also marine heat wave duration, and then also those longer term impacts from sea level rise and the impacts, the interrelationship that has with coastal flooding and the frequency of increased or higher water levels. The report then goes into looking at how those impacts impact specific sectors of society. So broken down into different areas of focus, so around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, risks to communities more broadly, risks to defence and national security, as well as risks to the economy. So some useful information in there around economic impacts and how that might specifically then translate into business impacts. Health and social support impacts, the infrastructure and built environment that would be required under these different scenarios, risks to the natural environment, also really useful information, particularly for the agriculture sector, as is the primary industries and food section of this report, where those particular aspects are specifically provided more detail for those specific impacts. So we've just included a extract from the economy, trade and finance sector. And so the hazards that we've spoken to before, then translating into, well, where are the particular exposures in this sector? So agriculture, mining, construction and tourism particularly, but also just businesses generally in the supply chain, outdoor workers, as Aletta mentioned earlier, and also impacting government resources because of the requirements for recovery. So particular vulnerabilities within the economy around infrastructure, impacts for that then would lead to higher household debt and reliance on climate sensitive industries like agriculture, and resource limited communities, and insurance is another aspect that is quite significantly highlighted throughout the report.
And I think, Ramona, what's really good about this report is that it goes further, and for these industries talks about the impacts as well. I think a lot of work has been done linking climate science, climate policy to climate risks and opportunities, but that last step to quantify or qualify or quantify the impacts is often a little bit hard, because it feels a bit unreal until you have that impact. So I like the way that they've included that in the report as well.
I think on the next slide, if you wanted to talk to that, Aletta, just give some examples around some of the quantification that's been incorporated into the report.
Absolutely. Did you want me to do this? So, for example, they talked about insured losses have grown, and they give you all the percentages. They've also said in 2024, 15% of household insurance premiums could be priced at more than 4 weeks of gross household income. It's a 25% increase from 2023. So insurance is absolutely a financial impact we're seeing at a lot of businesses. About the future, they've indicated there could be projected disaster costs. There could be losses around Australian property values. There's a perceived risk to the construction industry that could make it unaffordable or financially unsustainable insurance. They were talking about additional days of work are projected to be lost every year by 2061 due to higher frequency and intensity of heat waves, and then also that there could be an impact on labor productivity. So what I like about this is they haven't just called out the risk, but they've tried to quantify potential impact of that risk. And then the question is, how does that relate to your business to make it more, even more relevant? So that's all about climate science. Thank you, Ramona, for looking at the climate science. We also want to talk, and sorry, before we move on, climate science is all about climate change, and it's all about, you can see how this plays out in physical risk to the business, and then what are the financial consequences or impacts of all of that. The other thing to consider in order to identify transition risk is to look at climate policy. And again, if you look at climate policy, at the United Nations Framework Convention of Climate Change, they have a number of policies that's developed over the years. So we know the Paris agreements from 2015. We know we had the Global Methane Pledge in 2021. The UAE consensus in 2023. I think, Ramona, that's where we've got the first time that they're talking about moving away from fossil fuels, transitioning away from fossil fuels in energy systems in order to get to net zero by 2050. And then also in 2023, establishment of the Loss and Damage Fund. So you can see at a global level, again, driven by the United Nations, a lot of global policies that's been set. And then for different countries and different governments to make it their own in their jurisdiction. This is a diagram that we've tried to prepare to illustrate how climate policy flows through from a global level to a local level, to our country, Australia, flows through to industries, and ultimately flows through to your business. So we start with global and international policy, and that could convert into federal law, state law, local law. There could be industry-specific policies that develop, and we'll discuss a few of them today. And all of these will have impact on your suppliers. It will have impact on you. It could have impacts on your customers. And the other thing is that your global policies also create some stakeholder pressure on your entity, on customers and suppliers. So it's an ecosystem that works together. It starts at the global level and ultimately flows through to your business. Now, this is Ramona's favorite diagram and slide, but I'm going to try and talk about it today, Ramona. And this is a diagram that is talking about or trying to illustrate, and to me this is very clear, that if you look at that red line, that is the expected temperatures due to climate change based on implemented policies. And if you look at that red line and you compare it to the blue line, is if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees, there's a big gap between the red line and the 1.5 degree blue line. And in order to move the red line down to meet the blue line, we need a lot more policies to be implemented by government, not just in Australia, but across the world. And if we don't do that, or the longer we wait to do that, the harder it will be. So I think this gives us a really good idea. If you are working towards, or if you're doing a scenario analysis for a 1.5 degree world, we have to anticipate significant transition risks as a result of significant policy setting. So Ramona, I agree, it's a wonderful diagram. I'll go over to you for NGFS.
So thanks, Aletta. Talking about scenarios, a really good tool that can help inform the information that you need to conduct scenario analysis is the NGFS scenario framework and data that's sitting behind that. And I think this slide and their diagram really highlights that interaction between transition risks and policy risks. So their net zero scenario that's 1.5 degree aligned considers high levels of transition risk because of all of the policy that would be required under that scenario, but lower levels of physical risk. On the other hand, where transition risk is low, such as in the current policy scenario, that the level of physical risks is really quite high, but because of that lack of policy or policy settings staying as they are today, less transition risks. They also consider other scenarios. So as Aletta said, the longer it's left for policy changes to be implemented, that the harder it would be. And so that's considered in the fragmented world, a sector on this diagram they call too little too late, and as well as the delayed transition in the disorderly sector. So higher levels of physical and transition risks expected under the scenarios modelled by the NGFS in those scenarios.
Ramona, something that I was just thinking about, we talk about scenarios a lot today, but the purpose really is to talk about what are the climate science, the climate policies underpinning the identification of climate-related risks and opportunities. So it might be a good idea to just articulate again that when you look at scenario analysis, you can do scenario analysis for different purposes. And when we talk about scenario analysis here today, it's in the context of using scenario analysis and publicly available scenarios in order to identify climate-related risks and opportunities. In another webinar later this year, we'll talk about the use of scenario analysis to assess climate resilience, and there's a specific disclosure requirement around climate resilience in paragraph 22. So when you hear scenario analysis today, we are focusing on a particular use of scenarios and scenario analysis. Maybe, Ramona, in the interest of time, we've included some examples of Australian climate policies. If you wanted to touch on them maybe briefly, and then some of the other slides I'll do a little bit faster. We've got some great information and resources here, but let's try and move through them fairly fast.
Yes, so just some examples. So AASB S2 that we're talking about today has been implemented through an amendment to the Corporations Act, also emissions reductions targets that have been legislated and referred to in the Corporations Act and the amendment. ENGA is another example of an Australian policy, and this was where emissions reporting and also the safeguard mechanism sit in the National Greenhouse and Energy Reporting Act. And then some other sector or industry specific policies that are relevant, APCO around packaging, NVES, the vehicle efficiency standard, and also developments continuing around the nature positive plan and the establishment of an environmental protection agency in Australia.
Thank you very much. And Ramona, although we go through this really fast, all of this has a significant impact on Australian businesses and should be considered really closely. Maybe some of the other things to have a look at is, you know, the Australian government, again, I think September, I thought October, released our 2035 targets. And as part of that, also the net zero plan for Australia, sector plans, and our nationally determined contribution. And again, what a business in Australia does is heavily informed by the targets being set by the government in Australia. So important to have a look at the Australia net zero plan. This is all the documentation that goes with that, which is very useful when we look at identification of climate-related risks and opportunities. I think the sector plans, and they've developed 6, are very useful information as well. And we've previously shared them in a webinar, but I thought today Ramona and I could run through some of the high-level findings in these plans. So if you look, for example, at the electricity and energy sector plan, the plan sets out a pathway to 2050. And they're looking at 3 major shifts in our energy system. So first of all, using energy more efficiently, then electrifying and fuel switching, and thirdly, scaling our clean energy supply. So those are the key 3 shifts that they believe we need on an ongoing basis. And as part of that, they also talk that the energy transformation will occur in phases. And they've broken it down between now to 2030. So that was 2025 to 2030. Another 5 years, 2030 to 2035, and finally 2035 to 2050. So for example, from now to 2030, renewable generation increases to reach 82%. Delivering significant emissions reductions in the electricity sector and setting Australia up to decarbonise other sectors through widespread electrification. So this is the one thing that Europe has done really well, the way they've electrified Europe. And then you also need the renewable energy to support that, of course. Then from 2030 to 2035, they want to drive they want electrification and energy efficiency to drive decarbonisation across transport, the built environment, and industry sectors. And that is backed by this growth in firmed renewable generation. And then from 2035 to 2050, a high-performance renewable electricity system supports economy-wide electrification. So we can see that there's a plan and a pathway for this particular sector that has an impact on every business ultimately. Ramona, the industry sector plan.
So the industry sector plan focuses on emissions reductions in the industrial sector, so looking at the safeguard mechanism as the main policy lever there, but also around competitive industries, so the future Made in Australia agenda, so linking into other policy as well. And also looking at how that can support the transition with regional workers in different industrial regions and those sorts of things. So looking to facilitate collaboration across government, industry and the community. So with energy performance upgrading to bring immediate benefits, but electrification, harnessing new renewable energy or new renewable opportunities, looking at alternative fuels and also the development of new technologies. So as I said, to 2030, really the safeguard mechanism is the existing tool to drive abatement. And interestingly up for review in 2028, I believe. So potential for that mechanism to be adjusted or accelerated based on the outcomes of the review. So pathways for the industry sector as well, looking out to 2035, where really heavy reliance on the adoption of existing technologies that are expanding in use, and then out to 2050, looking for significant emissions abatement across all industries and new industry opportunities, as well as continued use of the safeguard mechanism to encourage abatement.
The other one is there's a particular sector plan for agriculture and land. And then, the outcome they want to achieve, agriculture and land are appropriately contributing to Australia's net zero goal. They've come up with some strategic objectives that Australian producers remain global leaders in low emissions food and fibre production, support diverse landscapes, balancing agricultural production, carbon storage, and nature repair, and then also looking at agriculture and land decarbonisation benefits in regional communities, producers and land managers, and including First Nations people. And they've also have their foundational actions. So a very interesting read if you're in the agricultural and land sector. There's also a sector plan around the built environment. And again, they've come up with their key outcomes and the supporting objectives. Emissions reduction is a key outcome, and the objectives, how do they want to achieve that? If you look at some of the objectives on emissions reduction, we've seen a number of our clients impacted by phasing down hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, used in refrigeration and air conditioning by 2036. Flexible electricity demand, solar and coordinated energy storage, retrofitting of existing buildings, etc. They've also looked at climate resilience in livability and fair and equitable transition. So really interesting discussions for the built environment as well. Ramona, I know you're very passionate about this one and a number of clients in this space, so I'll hand over to you, transport.
Transport is probably the next sector. So we've previously talked about energy and industry, and so already transitions and reductions in emissions and policy in place for that. Slightly limited policy in place around decarbonisation of transport, the transport sector particularly. So potentially an area where more policy can be expected in the future. So their 5 key priorities is to invest in enabling low and zero emissions transport infrastructure and to increase electrification. Also a switch to low carbon alternative fuels and innovation to increase competitiveness of transport technology options and scaling up efforts to reduce embodied emissions in transport infrastructure as well. So this plan sets out pathways for different aspects of the transport and associated infrastructure sector. So light vehicles, looking at EVs becoming increasingly affordable between now and 2030 particularly, and looking out to 2035 to 2050 that considering that fossil fuels will only be used in very specific circumstances. So a continued transition away from internal combustion engines in light vehicles. Heavy vehicles, slower adoption and different technology challenges around electrification, but consideration in the plan that the electrification will continue to increase as it has started to increase quite rapidly in China, and that the infrastructure will be built up to support that, but there'll be some continued need for LCLFs. So each different mode of transport, different pathways and different timing around electrification or alternative lower emission options for those. So across maritime aviation, the use of sustainable aviation fuels, and really the recognition that the infrastructure, particularly for electrification, will be required to make that transition in the transport sector.
Ramona, then we also know that Australia published a net zero plan. Initially, our target up to 2030 was 43% reduction in our emissions below 2005 levels. And then when they published this net zero plan in September, it is now a 2035 target of between 62 and 70% by 2035. Which sees a sharp decrease in emissions by 2035 and still heading towards a 2050 a target to be net zero. There's also been state and territory emissions reduction targets. So depending on which states you are or your business are, some different targets, and you can see some states faster. So Tasmania net zero by 2030. I think they're the first to be net zero. And if then ACT net zero by 2045, together with Victoria and the other states net zero by 2050. And from that plan, the 5 priorities for net zero from a policy perspective is to decarbonize and expand the electricity network, electrify and improve energy and material performance, switch to low carbon fuels, innovate to expand emissions reductions options, which is critically important that we innovate, and scale up carbon removals to balance the residual emissions. Again, this is an amazing report to read. Remember, what we're doing here is we're looking at policies that government bring in that impact your business, which is pushing your business to reduce emissions, and you have no choice in the matter because it's been brought in by government, and therefore how does that impact the transition risk for your business? International policy is also important because you look at your whole value chain. Your suppliers, yourself, and also your customers. And what BDO is doing is we're publishing on a quarterly basis a sustainability reporting jurisdictional update. And the focus of this update is looking at mandatory sustainability reporting. We know Australia is the first country in the world, but there's also some movement in other countries. So for example, in Japan, the Japanese Financial Services Agency conducted a consultation on proposed amendments to introduce mandatory sustainability reporting, IFRS S2, for listed companies with an average market capitalization of at least yen 1 trillion. And that consultation process closed in 26 September 2025. It looks as if they want to phase in, or what they've consulted in is to phase in a mandatory sustainability reporting from fiscal years ending on or after 31 March 2027, which is next year. And I know a lot of entities in Australia are subsidiaries of Japanese parents. So Australia is leading the way with mandatory sustainability reporting, but Japan, or the parent entity, will follow shortly. Another extract from that report to give you an idea, in Singapore, for example, they've got at the moment, they've got extensions to the timelines. They were quite aggressive with their timelines, and now they've got some extensions, and I've given you some of the details there. So this is a wonderful publication that gives you a regular summary of all the latest and greatest that's happening in all the countries. So if you want to know what's happening where your parent is located, or where subsidiaries are located, or where suppliers are located, this is a really good resource to have a look at. I apologize for going a little bit over time. However, I think it's an important foundation for what we'll be doing the rest of the year, looking at identification of climate-related risk and opportunities, also scenario analysis, also quantification, and ultimately the sustainability report. So from today, I hope that you got 3 takeaways. First of all, and that is the starting point for AASB S2 is the identification of climate-related risks and opportunities. And number 2, a basic understanding of climate science and climate policy is essential to identify and assess climate-related risks and opportunities. And we've tried to give you some information and some resources for future reading to give you that basic understanding of climate science and climate policy. And then finally, I'll leave you with a question: how do climate science and climate policy impact your business? That is the starting point, and then we can deal with the requirements of AASB S2. As always, BDO can help you. We've got the monthly webinars. We've got the carbon accounting masterclass where you measure your greenhouse gas emissions, and then we can have a conversation of decarbonization. We've got our monthly newsletters that you can register for. We've got our alumni event for our carbon accounting masterclass attendees. We've got our AASB S2 disclosure checklist. We've got an illustrative sustainability report. And these are our core services across carbon accounting, sustainability reporting, strategy, and finally assurance. A little bit of the description of all the things we do and the key people to contact at BDO. I would like to thank Ramona for presenting this webinar with me and sharing her expert knowledge. And thank you very much to all of you for attending our webinar. We appreciate it. We hope you can join us again next month, where we continue the AASB S2 journey. I hope you have a lovely day. Thank you.
Thank you.